as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Communication. And this is the first of our conversation series for this fall. We are very fortunate to be starting our conversation series with such a wonderful panel, as well as on such an important topic. I'm going to introduce our panel and talk a little bit about the topic today in just a moment, but I wanted to give a brief introduction to AADHum. I see a lot of faces who are joining us probably for one of our first time coming to one of our events. So AADHum is the African American Digital Humanities Initiative out of the College of Arts and Humanities. What we do is try to foster growth, development, support, learning, and training for people who are interested in doing work at the intersection of African American history and culture and digital humanities. What that means is we do a lot of training in terms of digital studies training sessions. We call them incubator sessions. And you may have seen as you were signing in that we have some information about our incubator training sessions that are starting next week. At incubator sessions, you can learn new digital skills, like next week we'll be talking about text encoding and TEI and Python programming. We'll be doing that for the next 6 weeks. These are important, interesting skills, CV building skills. I see a lot of undergraduates in here, right? And those are also important skills if you're interested in doing research at the next level, pairing up with graduate students, going on to do graduate studies, things like that. So I encourage you to take a look at that information regarding incubator sessions. We also host a workshop series that meets every other Wednesday, where students and faculty can present their in-progress research and get feedback from their peers. We have a scholars program that helps people prepare their research projects over the course of the year. And so we'll also have this conversation series ongoing. So I'll invite you to come on back actually next week on Monday in TAWS 1100 at 4 p.m., where I will be joined by Sarah Florini, who is an assistant professor at Arizona State University. Sarah Florini studies Black Twitter and Black practices of signifying and oral culture online. I studied the Black blogosphere, Black feminist discourse online, and we'll be joined by Dawn Dow, who's in the Department of Sociology here on campus, who studies Black women bloggers. We'll be talking about Black oral culture. We'll be talking about doing practice and studying Black folks' discourse in online spaces, methods, ethics, etc. Should be a great talk next Monday afternoon. So let me go ahead and introduce the panel that we have this Monday, or this week, who we're very excited about. We'll be talking about libraries today, talking about technology, justice, and culture. And joining us, we have Tahira Akbar-Williams. Tahira Akbar-Williams is the librarian for the College of Education and African American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She previously served as the education librarians and a faculty associate at the School of Education. At Johns Hopkins University, receiving her Master's of Library Science and a Master of Arts in African American and African Diaspora Studies from Indiana University in Bloomington. She finished her studies at The Ohio State University, where she taught women's studies and received a Master of Arts. She has published and presented at many conferences and in many journals. We welcome Tahira Akbar-Williams. Next to her is Trevor Munoz. Trevor Munoz is the interim director of the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities at the University of Maryland. He's also the assistant dean for digital humanities research at the University of Maryland Libraries, as well as the co-PI on our grant, African American Digital Humanities. He works to foster digital projects that involve close collaboration between libraries, archivists, and other digital humanities researchers. And as a part of this work, he has written, spoken, and consulted about strategic opportunities and challenges of doing digital humanities work within institutional and cultural structures of academic research libraries. Trevor Munoz holds a master's degree in digital humanities from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College in London, and a Master of Science in Liberal Arts Library and Information Science from the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Please help me welcome Trevor Munoz. Next to Trevor is Nicole Cook. Dr. Nicole Cook is an assistant professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she's also the program director for the Master of Library and Information Science program. Dr. Cook is a 2012 graduate from Rutgers University with a PhD in Communication, Information, and Library Studies, where she was one of the first 12 American Library Association Spectrum Doctoral Fellows. She holds a Master of Library Science degree from Rutgers University and Masters of Education and Adult Education from Penn State University. Previously, Dr. Cook was a tenured reference and instruction library at Montclair State University. Her research and teaching interests include human information behavior, particularly in online contexts, critical cultural information studies, and diversity and social justice in librarianship. She is the author of the book, Information Services to Diverse Populations, Developing Culturally Competent Library Professionals, and co-editor of the new book, Teaching for Justice, Implementing Social Justice in Library and Information Science Classrooms. She's published journals in countless other places. Please help us welcome her. is Howard Dotson. Dr. Howard Dotson is a Director Emeritus from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture of the New York Public Library, a specialist in African American and African diaspora history and culture. He has served as the Director of the Schomburg Center from 1984 to 2011. During his tenure, Dotson increased the size of the collection from 5 million to more than 10 million items, raised more than 100 million to support its programs and services, and increased its user base from 40,000 to over 125,000 annually. Through its research, education, exhibition, and cultural programs, Dr. Dotson has transformed the Schomburg into the premier center in the world dedicated to documenting and interpreting Africana heritage. A leader in the fields of historical and cultural preservation, Dr. Dotson made the center the gold standard in the field of specialization. He is the author and editor of more than 12 books, has curated more than 25 exhibitions, and is a graduate of Westchester State College and Villanova University. He also earned ABD in history at the University of California at Berkeley. The recipient of 5 honorary doctorates, he was designated a New York Living Landmark in 2010. From 2011 to 2015, Dotson served as the director of Howard University Library, and the director of Howard's Moreland Springer Research Center. And facilitating this wonderful panel is Dr. Javon Bickerstaff. Dr. Javon Bickerstaff earned her PhD in sociology from Harvard University. She is a postdoctoral fellow on the AADHum initiative and does all the things and does them also very wonderfully. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Javon.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Catherine, and thank all of you for being here with us, and we're going to jump right into this conversation. So this illustrious panel that we have with us, they have all worn multiple hats. They are scholars, they are researchers, they have been practitioners. And so when we think about these issues of justice and technology and culture, there is a long history in LIS, Library and Information Science, of social justice, right? One of the things that Nicole mentioned in her digital dialogues talk yesterday was that we've seen that history from the sit-ins to integrate libraries in Greensboro, North Carolina, to the way that libraries in both Ferguson and Baltimore remained open during the protests and uprising that were happening there, a very intentional decision. And so by way of kind of introducing yourselves in terms of social justice, can you give us a sense, each of you will go through, where and how do you see social justice in the role and mission of libraries more broadly, and in your work in particular? And Tina, we'll start here.
I loved I'm just going to back up and talk about what attracted me to libraries. It was a space that you can just do potentially anything. And so I started off at a public library, and we started off doing, we were in an area that was working class, and it had Hispanics and Latino, African Americans, and so it was mixed, and we had different programs. And you could do programs targeting, anything from learning how to work on a computer for basic skills to applying for a job to, English training. And so I like that. That's something that really attracted me to libraries. And then to go on and get a degree in it, to work in it, I think our potential is endless. And you see people in the community, particularly with the 2 examples that you gave with libraries staying open during the uprising, 2 examples of some of the work you do, but beyond that, just the level of activism you can have within a library in terms of your programming, the communities that you want to serve and support, and information that you want to get out, particularly when you talk about living in a society where spin and fake news are serious, and we're not talking about CNN, we're talking about that other stuff. You have Breitbart out there, you have a lot of different things out there who are giving you what we call those alternative facts. And so I think that libraries play a critical role in making sure that people are informed and educated, and then having the space and the people to come through and to get the right sources. So for our students here on the academic campus, we ensure that their research falls within the tradition of the scholars and researchers who came before them. You are doing your scholarly peer review, you are searching your databases, you are evaluating your information, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think our role is critical in that, to make sure we get it right. And so me in particular, for social justice for me, just became a part of librarianship. So when I was at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, I went out to, started a program there, created it to bring students of color / first generation college students into the library to learn about how the library can serve them, the space, the resources, how to do their research, what other elements on campus they have at their disposal. Because a lot of times you come in and you're in this big mammoth of a thing and you don't know where to go to. You have to find your space, and some people struggle to find that space and drop out, or just kind of totally get the all Fs and then drop out that way on purpose by accident. And I've done that a couple times. Don't front, don't purpose by accident, don't front. And so, but people struggling to find their way. And so I wanted to do something to open up that space in the library for them to say, hey, you know what? Not only do you have a space to come and study, not only have a space to come and hang out with your friends, but you have a space in which to really find your comfort, find your zone, and do your work, your scholarship. That's most importantly. And so, so from Tennessee here, was the last summer, we did a program for, so my biggest thing is introducing students of color to librarianship and letting them know the possibilities and what librarianship can do for you. Because a lot of people don't understand, they look at you and say, you're a librarian, like, what do you do? Where's the bun? Where's the, the sh, and where's the, so it's this traditional idea that we're breaking out of, and so, and two, work that we're doing differently from past librarians. So for example, this program put my field, which is, what did you say, Nicole, yesterday? We're 80% white,
and 83% white and female.
And so we really don't have a good representation within our field. And it is because a lot of times you go to undergrad and grad school, you don't hear about librarianship. And you don't know that it's a viable career option. And two, you can make a nice little check. Okay? And so people are like, not for me, I don't know what it is. And so undergraduate and graduate studies, I didn't really hear about librarianship. I learned about it when I was doing my my master's thesis on environmental racism, and I went into the library at my undergraduate organization, and I just kept going in and finding all this stuff, and my advisor was like, wow, where did you find this stuff? And then I was like, I was just doing research, and I talked to the librarians, and then I started to get more comfortable with them, and then they told me, yeah, this is a viable option for a field. So I fell into it by accident, and so so the program that I wanted to do was to try to introduce younger folk, and this program was designed to introduce young African American males, because my gosh, we have the number of black male librarians so low, and it's too somewhat reflective of the number of faculty that you have of associate professor and full professor on campuses. It's just really low. Okay, and so we wanted to introduce these young men to librarianship on a couple different levels: special collections, archives, subject specialists, and also the work of getting our white brothers and sisters to understand issues of social justice, microaggression, how they create the space for people to come into when they go into the workplace. So we have a library school, which I graduated from library school, and it was like maybe 2 African Americans when I graduated from library school, and some of the things I would hear in these classes were just like, would just really stop your breath to think somebody actually said that, and they said it out loud, and they're not being challenged except by me. And so you're the only person in the classes to do those things.
So I just want to pause you right
there,
because we're going to jump into the demographics more of this profession.
Yes. Okay, but let me just finish that. Yeah. I'll make it short. So so the profession just totally kind of just very, very white, very, very female, and less male. So the program was just designed to teach our library students about working with people of color, students of color, in an active way, building something, and also to introduce these 8 African American males to librarianship. So that's the part of the social justice that I jump in. It's just to really get in there and say, this is a space for you to not only to interrogate, but to create, to be creative, and to find your voice.
Great. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. My sort of journey into this looks quite different than Tahira's. I came to librarianship both in an academic research library context, without a lot of personal experience of working in a public library, though obviously been a user of a public library. Thought hard about the place of public libraries and their role with social justice, but then trying to bring it back in an academic library context, because that's where I found myself, and also as someone coming into librarianship sort of from technology, or at least from the digital humanities, which is the program I did first on my way into library school. And then when I got into library school, trying to connect things that were personally important to me and also bring together the digital humanities and librarianship. So I found myself starting to work more on thinking about how the social justice concerns that I was hearing and discussing with my colleagues, seeing examples like Tahira mentioned, could also find their way into areas of the library that often feel themselves not so directly connected to these concerns, that might be a public services or a public libraries kind of function, but to also look for all the ways that was embedded in the technology of libraries and the technological history of libraries. And so sort of following a path from thinking about big things that were happening, with the sort of growth of computer databases and information, like the rise of data and big data, how to put that in a humanities context, which meant thinking about who are the people behind these data points, and what are the layers of interpretation and cultural meaning that are embedded in big data, and how do we sort of parse that apart so we can keep that connected to the sort of our common humanity, or the stories of the humans that make up that data. And then trying to think about all the ways that those, all the scalability that we praise in digital systems is designed to sort of obscure some of those things for the productive functioning of an efficient technological system, and how to think about how to interrupt that scalability and complicate it from the technology side, and thinking about how that could also be a contribution to doing the social justice work of libraries and pushing it forward as libraries change in the technological age.
Great. So I think I might be a little different in that librarianship has been my first and only career. My friends heard me say yesterday that I started college as a pharmacy major and quickly and promptly failed out and needed another track to figure out what I was going to do as an undergrad. And so I was actually a communications undergrad and went right into library school out of undergrad. And so once I got into the profession, worked in a variety of libraries, mainly academic libraries, but typically I was the only one, right? So I was the only visible minority. And so librarianship is not always the easiest place for minorities. It's certainly better than it was. But I say that to say that I was always involved in social justice and diversity work, not even really understanding that that's what I was doing and that's what it could be classified as. But I would go to conferences, I would go to other libraries and look for the other one at the other library. And we would get together and we would figure out how to hold each other up, how to collaborate on projects, how to do peer mentoring, and really just figure out a way to make our own space. So to say that, when you mentioned earlier in the introduction this very long history, I will also say that when I was doing that work as a young librarian, I had no idea about the sit-ins, and I had no idea about the segregation that occurred in LIS education and all of these things, because those were not classes that we had. So when we did library history, we're talking about Western, sometimes white European history, and even then you weren't really talking about a lot of history, right? They just wanted to let you know how old librarianship was, and we moved on. But to say that I didn't know about the LGBTQIA plus roundtable at ALA, the American Library Association, or the ethnic caucuses, or all of the work that's been done for decades. And so also to kind of finish up on that point, the work that we were doing was considered service. It was not considered research. It was not considered serious work. This is what you did on your own time. And I also wanted to address what you mentioned about the librarians in the uprising. So Scott Bonner is the librarian at Ferguson in Missouri, and Melanie Townsend Diggs was the librarian at Pratt. She has since moved on to Prince George's County. And I think the thing that was really extraordinary for me about their particular story, these are two of the most humble, wonderful people you will meet, not only in the profession, but anywhere. And they were kind of dubbed, oh, it's radical hospitality, and they went above and beyond. They did their jobs. And I'm not saying this to denigrate them in any way, because I have talked to them both about this, but they will tell you this is what we do. Like, we're open all the time because there have been other uprisings and other events that the news didn't know about, and we were still open. So when you talk about social justice, and I think this is where I think my role comes in, I think a lot of people don't understand what libraries do. And I would kind of bring in this idea of they don't really understand that we have this social justice mission, even if it's not necessarily written down. And not really understanding that this was not an extraordinary act for a library. Libraries are there for their communities. They're supposed to be the heart of their community, and this is part of us caring for our communities and caring for our patrons. So in my position as a faculty member in a graduate LIS program, my job is to let my aspiring librarians know that this is what I expect of you, right? And so I'm going to give them that history that I didn't get. And I think a lot of minority students, a lot of minority librarians, and also librarians from otherwise marginalized or oppressed groups, social justice is not new for us. I think it's newer for the profession at large. And so how do we continue to normalize this conversation and set that as an expectation, and not that this is something extra that you do and something extraordinary that you should expect press for?
I'm very, very different. First of all, I'm a historian. I was never trained as a librarian. Prior to taking the job at the Schomburg, the only job I'd ever had in a library was I was a page in my undergraduate school library. And my job was they used to bind the journals and magazines at the library. And my job was to drill the holes in the back so you could put the thread through, so you could bind. That's about all I knew in the way of training for librarianship. But I came to work in the library from a social justice, basically life. You only have a need for social justice where there is injustice. And the African American community, growing up in the African American community during the era of segregation, et cetera, injustice was in your face 24/7. And either you developed a social justice mission or you basically capitulated to the injustice that was there. You didn't really have any choice on that. And so I grew up in a town, Chester, Pennsylvania. You couldn't go to the libraries. The school system was segregated. This is in Pennsylvania, 10 miles outside of Philadelphia. And the schools were segregated up to through the junior high school. And the only reason why they weren't segregated, the high schools didn't have enough budget to have 2 high schools. I mean, and so they kind of forced that along. But all through your life and your existence, the community I lived in, Main Street ran north and south, and on our side of the street, basically everybody moved across the streets during the day. But after about 6:30 or 7 o'clock, black folk didn't go across that side of the street, and they didn't go across this side of the street, except to go to the hoagie shop. You had to have, it was a free zone to go to the hoagie shop, otherwise you weren't lived there. Anyway, I came to the librarian thing. I was, I guess, socialized to be to have some kind of a service agenda. And when I finished my undergraduate and my master's program, I went into Peace Corps and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador for 2.5 years. Came out and went to work for the U.S. Peace Corps as deputy director of their recruiting program and director of all minority and specialized recruiting, dealing with all of the ethnic and racial groups, dealing with seniors, dealing with labor groups, etc., opening what was essentially a white middle-class college graduate opportunity to people who were not of those groups. And one of my prize stories, I set up the seniors recruiting program to recruit senior citizens. And my first recruiter was Jimmy Carter's mother, who had been a volunteer in India, came back, said she wanted to continue doing some stuff. Was there anything she could do? And I was just starting this senior citizen. I said, "You got a job, babe, go ahead." Anyway, I did that, was actively involved before I went to Peace Corps and after I came back in civil rights movement activities. Eventually ended up going out to Berkeley and the history department there. And while there, managed to talk myself into a year abroad experience in a place called the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, Georgia, which was actually the research arm of the Martin Luther King Center. And I went there after a period of some personal crisis after King was assassinated. Lost my way and went to Berkeley actually to try to find my way. Anyway, bottom line, ended up coming to the Institute, working at the Institute, but actually as a graduate student, and then came back and became its director and ran it for about 10 years. And when I left there, I went to the National Endowment for the Humanities and was doing diversity stuff there too, but before finally ending up at the Schomburg Center. They had a recruitment for a Schomburg Center library director, and the original description required you to have a librarian's degree. They searched nationally, did not find what they were looking for, and so they reopened the search. And I put in an application on the last day of the second search on the advice of one of my mentors who said I was perfect for the job. And when I read the job description, I decided I was. So I put in an application, and on the last day, and they actually hired me. And much of the work that I've been doing, social justice work, using scholarship and education programs and all the rest of that at the Institute of the Black World, became the foundation of my work at the Schomburg Center. And the Schomburg Center has, from its inception, had a social justice mission. There was never any question about that. And so all that I was doing was basically kind of updating that and trying to figure out how you maximize the resources that are there to reach and serve a very broad segment of, first of all, the African American population, but the American population in general. How do you take what is essentially an institution that is, quite frankly, at the time that I went there, was still perceived as a place that collected and stored books. And if you looked at its budget, and the New York Public Library's budget for that matter, the budget was organized around the collection, processing, cataloging, storage, and then the circulation of the books. I mean, that was the business of the library. And I came in and I put together a whole public affairs division that was doing all this programming, exhibitions, and all the rest. The library staff got very, very upset because they thought I was stealing their money and their positions in order to do this. But what I really was seeking to do was to find ways of creating some degree of intellectual and moral and ethical synergy between the education of the mind, which was what the book stuff was all about, and the way in which you engage and understand the world. And so I viewed the Schomburg as basically in some respects, a kind of citizen development project. And that was kind of an extension of the NEH. The NEH, it's not a motto, but it says democracy, one of the rationales, democracy requires an informed citizenry. Without an informed citizenry, you can't have a democracy. And so, applying that to the Schomburg Center, our job was not just to circulate and disseminate whatever books were there, but to create frameworks for people to both think about questions and raise questions and engage with people, from family to leading scholars, about these questions of justice and freedom and human dignity, specifically as it related to the African American population. But in all honesty, it was as it related to the practice of American democracy. I need to underscore that, especially in this context that we're in, as it related to the practice of American democracy, because if America is operating on the basis of its principles, then it's a social justice society. And if it's not a social justice society, it is failing to be America. Okay.
So, Dr. Dotson, you bring up some really interesting issues that kind of touch upon what each of you have said. First, the notion that the role of the library, a mythology of the role of the library is to collect the books, keep the books, distribute the books, allow people to engage with the books. That understanding of that being the primary or only or central part of the profession versus the way that you've all described it as something that helps educate people, helps train minds, helps open doors, always is part of the community in ways that challenge these ideas of neutrality, right? The idea that the library doesn't just exist as this kind of Switzerland in society, but that it has a role in justice, in service, in engagement. And yet, what we know is that there's a very hefty mythology about neutrality being the way that the libraries are supposed to operate. That I imagine is also tied to the demographics of the profession and how it's been set up. And so could you talk a bit about the kind of persistent notion of neutrality and the investment for some corners of the library profession in that narrative and how you engage with that in your work in social justice?
Well, I'll start. In an unjust world, you can't be neutral. Because your neutrality is basically your capitulation to the injustice. So from whether it's the library or you as citizen, if you're living in an unjust world, you have to take a position one way or the other. And if you don't take a position, you're taking a position. Okay? And so the idea of neutrality, I think, as originally, I say framed as a core part of library identity, was that the library didn't try to prescribe what you should think. It provided you with the resources which to examine the evidence and arrive at your own conclusion. And I think that principle is worthy of emulation. At the same time, it should not be a situation where, the Schomburg was part of the New York Public Library. The New York Public Library was funded by the city and state of New York. So there were constraints on how far I could go with my politics. And nobody ever knew what my politics were. And the reason why was I created situations where the more controversial it was, the more I wanted it in the library, but I would always have two sides. And let the ideas fight themselves out. I loaded it up with my people. But get my result. But bottom line was that you don't run away from controversy. You can't run away from controversy in libraries. You have to create context for understanding in libraries, and you do that by bringing people around the table of diverse views
Yes.
and letting the best minds, best views win. And that's what I ended up doing at the Center.
I'm going to piggyback on this, and I'll give you a very practical example and then a less practical example. And to your point, this is one of the most stressful and persistent topics that we deal with in the library, in the classroom, et cetera, because, it's just this very idea of, libraries are supposed to be access to information, right? And so we're supposed to have like this Switzerland view, and we're supposed to have all of these, different viewpoints. And I agree that we're supposed to have different viewpoints. But let's think about our collection development librarians. So those are the librarians that purchase the books for the collection. And so, if you watch some of the social media spaces that librarians talk about, there's always some controversy because there's always some book that someone doesn't want to purchase. Mm-hmm. So Milo Yiannopoulos has a book out. The librarians are fussing about whether or not they should buy this book. Now, personally, would I read the book? No. But do I have people in the community that I serve that want that book? Possibly, right? So if we are really about access to information, we have to have all opinions and then let the minds fight it out. But in terms of collection development, there are going to be many librarians that don't buy that book because they don't like it and they don't want to read it. And so there's an enormous power that comes with access and selection and purchasing and all of these things. And I don't think a lot of people really think about that, because we are in a society where if you think about going to the library to borrow a book and they don't have it, well, that's cool, I'll just buy it on Amazon, right? So we have many other different points of access now that we didn't have previously. But for every decision that you make, there is a reasoning behind it. And see, this is where implicit bias comes through. This is where people's biases and prejudices and things come through, and all of this factors in, even if it's not explicit. And then perhaps the less concrete, practical example is when I talk about diversity and social justice in the classroom, I equate library neutrality to this idea of color blindness. Mm-hmm. So this idea when people say, I don't see color, sure you do, mm-hmm. right? So, but let's unpack that a little further. When you say that I don't see color, when you are saying that to me as an African American woman, you are essentially saying that you don't see perhaps the most prominent part of my identity, right? That's who I am. So are you saying to me that you don't see me? That you are erasing me, you are erasing my culture, you are erasing a lot of the things that are important to me, right? So I think that colorblindness really got caught up with this idea of library neutrality. Every decision we make has a rationale behind it, whether we want to admit it or not. So I mean, I think, library neutrality, like a lot of other things, these things are good on paper, right? But they don't necessarily translate into everyday and how we have to interact. And so I think it's important for us to have this conversation. It's important for us to have these conversations in our workplaces, in our classrooms, because we need to be looking at these things in full context, as opposed to saying, but we should really be holding library neutrality. We need to be neutral. We need to be objective. We can't do that. So we need to have a larger conversation about why we can't do that and the injustices that come into play as to why we need to fight back in different ways, and we need to build our collections in certain ways. We need to compose our staff in certain ways and have representation, and all of the things that we do. This is this part of this larger context because we don't have neutrality in that way.
So I just need to add this. We who live in America refuse to accept the fact that we have been and are a colonial society. Mm-hmm. Okay? And the things that we do reinforce and perpetuate that structure of colonialism with this white supremacist, kind of mantle on it. So, not just libraries, but universities and disciplines and the publishing industry
Yes.
are all a part of this colonialist enterprise, defending, protecting, and promoting it, sometimes aggressively, sometimes not, but it's a reigning kind of a hegemonic presence in our lives, and we don't talk about it. I mean, you can't even find it in our history. It kind of disappears in our history books very early on, but it's there. And I mean, again, just as examples of the size and scale of these campuses, et cetera, that we end up building, are all kind of mind manipulations of the mind of those who are in there, so that you look up to them with a certain kind of reverence and stuff. And with it comes the authority of their voice, irrespective of what the content of that voice is. And
So in thinking about these issues of objectivity, of neutrality, they get complicated a bit more when we start thinking about, it's not just in the physical presence, it's not just in our disciplines, it's also in our technologies, right? And so thinking about the ways that this myth of neutrality is complicated by the similar myth of neutrality that exists in the digital world. Trevor, can you speak to us a bit about that?
Well, a little bit, and I wanted to jump and sort of bridge from that last discussion, because I think like part of why this can be such a struggle for librarianship to deal with is that there is this mix of institutionalization and socialization. Yes. Like that, I wrote that down when Dr. Dodson said that about socialization, because there's a lot about librarianship and the way that it's practiced that is based on socialization, right? And that is becomes baked into the institutional structures in certain ways. And I think that's a really critical thing to be able to look at, like, where are these practices about a kind of socialization that is then a reflection of a certain demographic group who are the society that is making these particular values, and how do those become embedded in the structures? And I think extending that analysis to technology as well, and thinking about, you know, the ways in which sort of all the cataloging systems that determine where the books are that you find in the stacks, how those categories were determined and who determined them, and how hard it is to change them. I mean, there was a huge struggle in the library community about, you know, the Library of Congress subject heading about illegal aliens and trying to get that changed. You know, and then there was the interference from people outside the library community when it was already a problematic enough issue. But like then, you know, that becomes, so like now the Library of Congress subject headings have become like a big set of linked data that the Library of Congress publishes that people use to organize all these other sets of knowledge, because it's out there, it's by a reliable resource, the Library of Congress. And so these certain sets of assumptions about the world and the way we know about it get perpetuated into technological structures as well, if we haven't sort of confronted them and broken them down and said, like, this is a socialization of a particular kind of worldview and not some sort of imminent truth. And I think being able to look at our institutions that way, and then look at the operation of our technological systems that way. I mean, so not only the fact that the library profession is, you know, over 80% white and female, but, you know, the technology profession also being incredibly white and male in that case, right? And so where in that collision of these two cultures of library technology can we make space to sort of do this social justice work and get these other voices represented so that we can sort of reshape the structures that we're inheriting.
And I want to just kind of pick up on all of kind of what they said, and just to give you some ideas of, you know, it's not all, you know, doom and gloom. The space that you're in, I think that when you work with individuals in libraries, and I work from public library to academic libraries, everyone in there, you know, will say, I'm a good person, I believe in this, I believe in that, but your presence and the ideas that you bring up will challenge that. And you hope to get in spaces where people won't take it personal, or they'll step back and say, okay, you're not challenging me, you're challenging an ideology. Because, you know, we talked about the structures and the systems of white supremacy, and like where they have, you know, embedded themselves, and people have just walked on to kind of say, okay, that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But your mere presence and the questions that you bring in those spaces will we'll challenge that, and hopefully we'll challenge that and subvert it in some way. And so I wanted to talk about a couple things when we talk about, you know, librarianship and being present. I went to an ASALA conference, and I went to a digital humanities session with these African Americans who were, ASALA is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And we have historians, we have a librarians section in there, and these scholars were talking about the ways in which they did their work and how their work was welcomed among your universities and their colleagues, and how they were putting out information about, and one of Trevor's colleagues, I forgot, is Justin, his name was Justin Lacey, and say it again? Hosby. And his presentation was awesome because the ways, so me as a librarian, I try to reach out to people, particularly in terms of technology, to say, you know, we can use GIS, we can use open journal system, and I introduce these things particularly to scholars of color to say these are the other ways you can do your work. Well, Justin incorporated that in his work, and he was showing how the public school systems turned into charter schools after Hurricane Katrina, and he did a map where topographically was representative of where the charter schools were at, and then laid it out with funding and people, and it was just brilliant. And you can sit there and look at this map and watch this presentation and see before the storm and after the storm. And he talked about the politics around that. And so I think that space and those scholars in that room really got a really good understanding about how they can use this information to inform and to truth tell, right? And to set the record straight so people are very clear about what happened and who it's happening to. And so those digital spaces, I think, are so important, but that's one reason why I think you should, you know, definitely come into libraries to see what else is at your discretion. So that's big to me. And another thing that I learned as a librarian and a subject specialist, I go to ASALA because the scholars there are not mainstream. They don't get picked up by the big presses, the national presses, and their work in terms of like you know, civil rights movement, in terms of their personal experience, is really important for you as students to read. So I collect something, and then you sit down and you read it and you say, this is a perspective I would have never received. I would have never read this story or this article from these people if I didn't purchase that. So you have to, like he said, when you talk about these structures, to think about the ways in which you can disrupt the structures, and you can give people that other perspective that they're not getting mainstream, because we are in an institution, and you are, all of you who are students are being institutionalized, okay? Because that's what an institution does, and that institutionalization will creep into your selfhood and the way in which you practice your work if you don't wake up and kind of see what's really going on here, and what am I ascribing to, and what am I doing? And so that's just
So if we think about some of the issues that all of you have raised, both about the demographics of the profession and the biases and assumptions that come along with that, the question of social justice is also a big part of it. Is what do you do? And so in the edited volume, one of the things that Nicole and Miriam Sweeney write in the introduction is that there's often this kind of conflation of diversity and social justice. And they make this distinction that while the recognition and commitment to diversity is about including and incorporating different perspectives and culture, social justice goes farther than inclusivity. Social justice, they write, implies action. It challenges us to work towards the betterment, equality, and respect for those we want to include. And so where do you see points of possible intervention for not just broadening the kind of demographics of the profession, but how we think about it, the collection.
Programs and things of that nature, and it's very easy to get caught
social justice and thinking about what the user wants as opposed to what we think the user should have.
Add to that by saying, like, I think taking the technological transformation that libraries are undergoing, along with every other part of our society, as like an opportunity to intervene at this moment and to take that change and sort of wrangle it to the purposes that we have had it change towards. Right? So why should our digital libraries replicate or try to replicate our physical libraries? Right? Like, what if we used the building of our digital libraries as an avenue for change, as sort of redressing or building a more socially just and socially responsive collection that we would like to see, instead of sort of taking the existing treasures of the library and putting them online and saying, like, that's what we're going to do first. Why not take the things that have been neglected by the library but are super important and super relevant to communities that we want to be in touch with and do those first? I mean, it requires us to say we must change our values and make this look different than that.
Just even a very ongoing and recent example is that libraries and archives have been collecting protest posters and all of the things that are left at the different sites in Ferguson and Baltimore and all of the places that have, had strife, and there are so many. They're incorporating that into digital collections, and this idea of community archives and this idea of really having the community participate in the curation of the stories, of the data, of the the stories that are being collected.
And encouraging students and people who are scholars to take up that mantle. If you want to, a lot of people are obsessed with being on Facebook. I'm not one of them, but I know people for hours and hours going through things, scrolling things, Twitter. But that space that you're using, you can use to create your project, something that is, near and dear to you, and something that you don't think is out there. So we talked about the archivists. We had a meeting at the Sala and talked about going after Black Lives Matter and trying to connect with them and get their information before someone else gets it another location. And there was a huge discussion about that. Well, should we take, if we do get them to give us their material, should we then put it on a university space, or should we start a separate space in which we have control over? Because we can control the conversation and the rhetoric around this type of material. If you institutionalize it, these are the things that can happen, and libraries are this structure, so we have to be careful of that. So that conversation went back and forth, and of course, we're still going to be talking about it, but very important for you as people who, see yourself as creating this, if you can go out and do, social media, or create this online platform, you can also do that in the digital realm with, various kinds of information and various types of technologies if you go in and talk to people about that, so that space is there. And when I talk to scholars and they're doing their research, their dissertations, their thesis, and I say, well, have you ever thought about using, a different platform to show this, doing it online versus writing your article, and try to introduce them to the different technologies they can use to kind of represent that in different ways, and it blows their mind. I'm like, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, you can do that. So to have those people to encourage them and to give them options in terms of how they can represent this information digitally, because if we can get Black Lives Matter, that information into an archive and be able to really tell the story from that perspective, from people that is near and dear to their hearts, the African American people who, really are conscious and into social movements and want to represent them, that information versus someone else getting it and telling the story from their perspective. So that's really important.
There were at least a half dozen instances or times when various parts of the New York Public Library basically said there was no longer a need for the Schomburg Center.
Wow.
And they would say, well, we're collecting that now. What they were collecting was the published literature. And occasionally they go after a collection of a distinguished Black person. But all that grassroots stuff was not of interest to them at all. And none of that would have been collected and preserved had not the Schomburg Center been there. And again, from both an intellectual standpoint and others, certainly from a social movement perspective, stuff starts on the ground. It doesn't start up in the suites. And if you don't know what went on in the ground, you don't know how it even got to the suites. And so the Schomburg was kind of on the ground, looking for stuff that would be the foundation of the new questions to be asked about the Black experience and the new ways in which we might go about interrogating that experience from the perspective of people of African descent. And the scholars who ended up coming out of our scholar in residence program said a couple of things to me that were very interesting, and they would say it repeatedly. Number one, they come to Schomburg with a proposal that we had thought enough of to give them a grant to work on it. In their home institutions, predominantly white, they spend all their time trying to justify the legitimacy of the question they were asking. Couldn't even have a conversation about what the content of it was, for people raising questions about its legitimacy and all the rest of that, and basically trying to keep it off of the agenda, trying to keep, in my judgment, to keep the Black voice silenced. And if you go back to the slavery period, one of the first acts carried out was to silence the Black voice. They couldn't even testify in cases in court in their own behalf. And so this, if you will, silencing of the Black voice is something that, again, if you look at the disciplines and the profession, part of the reason why people aren't in them is because they don't want to hear those voices. And if those voices have any legitimacy and authority, it'll call into question everything else that they're doing. And that question doesn't apply just to Black people. I mean, the other thing that's crazy about American history, virtually everybody has been silenced in American history, except the ruling elite. And if you look at your traditional American history, the Irish, the Italians, the Scotch-Irish, etc., show up in that chapter on migration. And then they mysteriously disappear and become white. And the only time that you hear anything about them is every 4 years when they're running around trying to find somebody to vote. Okay? But their presence and active engagement in damn near everything that's going on in America is not something that is in the books. And it's not something that the nation kind of embraces and celebrates. That's why they have so much difficulty dealing with the concept of diversity with people who are not white. so anyway, this is a very, very complex place. It's a very, very complex place. And at the same time, it's ripe for new knowledge and new understanding. And if we can figure out how to get the sources, you all can do the work.
So one of the things that is interesting with this panel is that you all inhabit a really particular space, right? You're not just practitioners, you're not just scholars, you're not just educators, you are all of these things. And so you inhabit a space where there's a potential to push the boundaries of the profession, both in terms of the demographics and who you try to attract to it and bring into it, but also what kinds of questions are we asking? What kinds of things are we included? And so if you think about your own work, where do you see as the place where you want to see those boundaries pushed most?
I'm intrigued, this whole technology world offers incredible opportunities on the one hand, and equally incredible challenges. And while the bots can run the machines, somebody has to think about what the bots are going to do. And so I'm intrigued with how you take the new technology and ask the new questions with the big data kind of samples and stuff, and come up with questions that are centered in issues of human development, not, if you will, economic development. Not purely economic development. we are a materially and technologically overdeveloped society and socially and politically underdeveloped. And because of that, we are underdeveloped as human beings. We have one in the presidency right now. But in all sincerity, if we do not find ways of turning the technology to serve human interests, quite frankly, technology will take you out of being, out of existence. And so that's very real. And that's very real. Not just economically, but socially, politically, and otherwise. They can think deeper than you can. I mean, so just beware. If you don't put yourself back in the center of the conversation, you won't be in the center of the conversation.
And speaking of being in the conversation, I think one of the boundaries that I'm thinking about in response to your question is this boundary of language. I think we dance around a lot of things, and we're not naming things for what they are. So if we want to talk about white supremacy, white privilege, oppression, and all of these things, we can't just say, let's get together and have a conversation about diversity. Or unity, or multiculturalism, or now it's becoming inclusion, right? What does that really mean? And so I think, you can have conversations with people and they're having a completely different conversation. And I think as part of with this language and conversation are the spaces that we have them in. Like, I'm completely comfortable having this conversation with you in this room. Now, when I go back to Illinois and we have certain spaces, there are certain conversations you can't have, right? So I think
without fear of loss of your life.
Yes. I mean, I live in a place where there are a lot of sundown towns. There's sundown towns everywhere, but there's a nice little concentration where I am. So there's a safety issue for lots of reasons. For those of us in academia who don't have tenure yet. There's a certain risk inherent with some of these conversations, and you have to decide how important this is to you. And I take risks all the time that, people tell me, you really shouldn't have said, I don't care anymore. I'm going to go ahead and say that. But there is a calculated risk involved. So in terms of language and safety for these conversations, I think that we need to be pushing those boundaries. Because when we talk about loss of voice, that is a significant loss of voice. If there's any type of fear associated with what you feel like you want to say that is part of your identity. And I think also part of this, an extension of that is this normalization of talking about social justice and equity and equality. And it shouldn't just be a blip on the radar or something that we cover 1 week in a semester, or we have a special program in February for Black History Month and things of that nature. I had a conversation with an administrator who was giving me flack about some of my work and saying, well, there's a difference between what you do and teaching Shakespeare and calculus.
Oh, really?
And I said, no, sir, there's not. I said, so let me ask you this. I said, are you saying to me that there are no women or people of color or people from marginalized populations who are scholars in the area of Shakespeare or calculus? I said, so when you go back to your office and you look at your syllabus, dollars to donuts, your syllabus is all white men. And he, you could see the wheels turning. And he said, I think it is. And I said, so there are no women in your area? Well, of course. I said, do you include them in your syllabus? Because this is part of the normalization. This is part of what Trevor and others were saying earlier in terms of if we keep perpetuating this, this is what is seen as standard. This is what is seen as the classics. So I would challenge, my fellow faculty and other educators. We can do better. We can do a lot better. And when we talk about social justice and diversity, I mean, there's a range of things that we can do within that spectrum. We're not always talking about supremely grand gestures that get us arrested and things of that nature. It could be strictly diversifying your content, that you are saying to your students that this is important knowledge, that these are important voices. that you need to be familiar with.
So I want to pick up on that because the examples that I've given are those in which you go and disrupt those small spaces in the way you do your work, the way you do your practice day to day. And I'm going to say this, and it'll be controversial, but I'm going to say it. Donald Trump is a gift. The gift that keeps on giving. And I turn on the TV every day and my stomach drops, but my joy comes. And it comes because when he was elected, I had an opportunity to have conversations with colleagues and people that I had not had before about sexism, about racism, okay, about white supremacy. I mean, I'm in my office like, I love me some Obama, but I was joyful. Because when Obama was in, people were safe, we were fine, everything was good. When Trump came, all the racist, sexist, all the things that he said, I'm allowed to have what Nicole was just talking about, to really engage in those conversations. And also to talk to colleagues about, well, how do you feel about it? What does it mean to you? How has it changed your work? How did it change your day to day? And some people are quick with responses, and some people are just bit kerfuffle, like oh, that's what this is supposed to do, right? This is supposed to give you that woke sensation and change what you're doing day to day. So I love having those conversations. And when coming back from Puerto Rico, when he gets back, we're throwing towels at people. Okay, that's how your grand gesture and to help people to throw towels and compare, Katrina to this. I'm going back to the office. We're talking about that. Like, what is happening here? You tell me. And so that allows people to really engage in those spaces and places that they never thought they would go, and to challenge themselves. So that's been my
yeah. I mean, at the same time, like that, it's brought a lot of the sort of like ugly truths out of the open for more people to see them. Like, I think it also frames it again, and like some of the efforts around social justice in a kind of disruptive mode,
yes.
where it is not normalized in the way that Nicole is talking about, where it's this eruption that then suddenly has to be dealt with as though it is like a disruptive intrusion upon our sort of peaceful life, where that means we haven't gotten to the point where these conversations are normalized, right? We're still struggling with like...
And I would go with that I think we are disrupting, that if you thought everything was all right because Obama was elected president, that was the normalization of really what was going on already. Black men were already being killed, social, the police, violence in black communities, et cetera, et cetera. But that stuff was happening. So the conversations were normalized. But what I think he did for folk is to allow you to get into the mucky of the conversation and really start to name things for what it is. So we're talking about white supremacy now. We're talking about violence against black bodies. We're talking about spaces that promote white supremacy. We're talking about spaces that shut women down from speaking. So we are, that was I think it was normalized that people thought we were in a safe space. And believe me, of course I don't, parade, Trump is not, of course, my favorite person, but I'm saying what it has allowed us to do socially is to have these conversations with people who considered themselves liberal and woke, and what he did for them was to reawaken, and for us to be able to come in and interrogate those spaces a little bit more.
So I want to just jump in with one last question, because we do want to take some questions from the audience and to make sure that they have a chance to ask, and we only have 20 minutes left.
I got one brief kind of focusing statement. America is a social justice project. If you read the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. That's a social justice agenda. And if you go back and look at the Declaration of Independence text, the same principles are inscribed there. So we have an obligation as citizens to be working on that social justice agenda. Everybody does. And if it's going someplace other than social justice, then you're taking it away from being an American. I mean, the people who were at Charlottesville, they were invoking the Confederate States of America's agenda, not the American agenda. And we have to be clear about that.
So if folks have questions, I'm just gonna ask that you come up to the front of the room so we can pick you up on the microphones better. One last question I wanna throw out there for 45 as a gift who keeps on giving, is to think about this notion of kind of mis and disinformation, right? Both in your role as professionals and how you understand the profession and how you grapple with this kind of ways that the technology enables these kinds of conversations that happen so quickly and the information comes out and it's so vast, which is why I'm so analog. But it's all oftentimes alternative facts, right? And so how do we grapple with the fact that there's the proliferation of information in general, the astounding rate with which we create information in general right now, but then when it's mis and disinformation, how do we grapple with that?
So I actually do a lot of work in this area, and the gift that keeps on giving, I have been enormously busy since November, writing and researching about fake news, and none of this is new, right? So we've always had propaganda, yellow journalism, and all of these things. It just has a brand new name and it has a new significance with current events. I would also suggest that within this mis and disinformation, we have a lot of mis and disinformation about cultural images. So so the stereotypes are running rampant, right? And to Javon's point about the proliferation of information, this is classic information overload, right? And so when people get overloaded, they shut down, right? And so there's also a lot of emotion attached to information. You know, you don't watch Fox News, you don't watch MSNBC, I can't have a conversation with you, we can't discuss the issues. And I think we need to acknowledge those emotions and figure out how to have conversations, because the information is not going to stop, but we have to figure out how we are processing and applying that information to have this democratic society and be able to push through these recent events in people that are in power.
Sure, Rebecca, you want to jump?
Well, I was going to add, I think, like, beyond the history of fake news, also the history of information overload, which is not a new phenomenon either, right? I mean, you have people, 16th, 15th century talking about how overloaded with information they are. And so I think, but I agree with Nicole's point about dealing with the emotions, because I think and this goes back to, I think, the self-image of librarianship about, like, the power of information and its kind of separation from emotion. And I think sort of like arguing against that narrative and acknowledging those emotions, that, like, the information overload and what we do with it and the fake news and what we do with it are not, like, they are not causes, they are reflections of lots of other things going on. And we can't grapple with the one without dealing with the emotions that come from the other.
And this even goes back to the earlier question of neutrality, right? So neutrality means that we don't have any emotion. It means that we're making very cut and dry, black and white decisions, and we're not doing that. It's not how things work.
So I'm just going to ask, are there any questions out there from the audience? Because we can let this conversation go. So yes, go ahead. You'll probably be picked up.
Thank you first for talking about classics in general. I always think about people referring to, like, Alexander Pope and different classics for British literature, American literature, while negating the fact that we lost a lot of geniuses because they were chained below the deck and they were never actualized. And then the second part of my question is, in terms of Edward Snowden, you can question his validity or whether you agree with him or not. He said something really significant in terms of technology and social justice. He said that the FBI was monitoring Black Lives Matter protests via drones. And in terms of, like, having a social justice space, how do you do that safely on the web? Does everyone need to get a VPN? Or, how do we teach that within library space and research space? But also ensure that that's, you're able to have your voice heard without incriminating yourself or having to worry about that in general.
So I think that there is, in this day and age, that we had COINTELPRO with the Panthers, so you just don't, it's people are going to monitor and find you. And I know Nicole has an example of this that she'll probably talk about, but unless you're anonymous and you do the VPN and do all that stuff, people will find you and people will, who was that professor at Harvard that spoke against Trump and got, death threats? Princeton?
Yeah.
Princeton, and the death threats. And so we're hearing so many instances of that, of people exercising their right to speak up and do that. But it doesn't mean that it's still worthwhile to do it. It's just how you do it. But I think the safety issue is being, ripped back, viciously with this, the news cycle that we have and, social media being able to put your face and your name out there.
Well, these at least two distinctive, I'll call them truth spaces. One that's supposedly that is the fake news, and the other one that's supposedly the real news, which is the little news, which is fake news. What I'm concerned about is that certainly a lot of what Trump has said has been, if you will, kind of branded in people. Let me put it in a different kind of way. Trump's core believe everything he says.
Oh my God.
That's not accidental. That was not something that was accidental. That's, if you have gone back and read about the Nazis, that's what Hitler did. And Trump's assault on the media was to basically eliminate alternative voices so that his was the only one that was heard. And the people who've locked into that have a, I'll call it a damn mind melt. And you can't have a conversation with them out of this other space because in their mind, you're in the alternative facts space. And that's probably the most threatening thing facing America right now. The number of people who are in that, I have absolute truth because Trump told me, space, who A, are not prepared to listen to you, but B, are prepared to mobilize others against both you and anybody else that questions Mr. Trump. So that's scary.
I just want to come back to the question that you asked about how to be safe. And I mean, I think there are ways in which this isn't, it has never been safe to protest. It has never been safe to fight, the powers of injustice, right? And so whether it was the network of lawyers who had to bail people out of jail, now it is part of the training about how to keep yourself safe, from having your information, put out there on the internet, how to protect, your, privacy of your own sort of online stuff. And those are things that people in protest movements are now sort of learning and teaching each other. And that, sadly has become part of the act of modern protest, is to be safe in that way. But I mean, and then also connecting it to the institutional work that, libraries are doing in some places, hosting or providing those trainings, but also then connecting that to the bigger issues of if you do it first to the Black Lives Matter protesters, what will stop you from doing it to everyone else all the time? And so what is our sort of social response, however you feel about Black Lives Matter, that this is an intrusion against, basic American values?
Just really quickly, piggybacking on some of the things that were said. So Tahira was referencing some online harassment that I experienced over the summer by a right-wing campus group that essentially doxed my professional information and were sending people to my office. And so this idea of having to strip my website and having to take precautions and, to Trevor's point, locking down social media and really figuring out how to protect myself, because the people that came after me were referencing work that I haven't even done yet. They saw a title of a grant that I was awarded, and they just took it and ran, right? So this idea of arming ourselves with information, but also kind of, summoning the cavalry, right? So when I went to my administrators, they didn't know what to do, and they weren't particularly interested because it hadn't happened to them yet. So I think it's very complex when we're talking about protecting ourselves and getting others involved to kind of, protect, everyone as a collective, as opposed to saying, well, that's too bad, let me know how that works out. And, because then, you're talking about silencing of voices and things of that nature, because we're getting into a new age where there's like physical harm. And I don't want to imply that that wasn't always a case, but now we're seeing physical harm as a result of the cyber information, which is a slightly different component. But just to say, we need to, again, be having more of these conversations and having some of these things institutionalized. Not only what Trevor was saying about the library being host for some of these workshops, but also moving through the ranks in universities and other corporations. And everybody should be on board to respect everyone's right to democracy and free speech, and not having certain people targeted and singled out because they're talking about something that's not popular.
So, first off, we have about 4 minutes left, and so if there's one more question, quickly.
Okay. So my question follows up on Dr. Cook's statement that we need to leave the building and addresses Dr. Dodson and the Schomburg Center's role in preserving the African burial ground. And so thinking about, what do you see as the social justice role of libraries and librarians in influencing institutions and spaces beyond the library?
Very quickly, I was called by the then mayor, David Dinkins, to head a mayoral advisory committee right after the quotes burial ground was quotes discovered in quotes. Everything's in discovered in quotes. And I met with him and pulled together a group of people, and he had some questions, and we answered the questions, and I gave him the report, and I thought I was through. 17 years later, I was still working on the burial ground project. And this became, in my mind, a moral obligation of a place like the Schomburg Center. And again, it stems from the fact that injustice was being done there, and it was injustice to the ancestors. And for whatever reason, they had made an appearance after 200 years. And our interpretation was that they had made an appearance for some purpose. And our job basically was to figure out what their purpose was and to ensure that they with dignity and self-worth were not further violated. I mean, the reason why we ended up in the middle of it, they were taking the bodies out. At times wrapping them in newsprint, other times just dropping them in boxes and shipping them over to their morgue with no concern for spiritual or moral or anything else. And that's a level of injustice. First of all, the people who are already dead, but to do it in our face. So we had to do something about that. And the Schomburg ended up being on the point of it because we had the moral authority to do it. And basically we simply imposed that moral authority on the GSA and on the Park Service and everybody else, and basically demanded justice. And I don't know, again, the Schomburg Center is a unit of the New York Public Library. I was never clear where the New York Public Library stood on this action. It really didn't give a damn. Because it was something that particular institution, if the injustice continued, we had no right to a moral and ethical existence. And so, and every turn, I was in it for 17 years because every time you looked around, they were trying to pull some more shit. Pardon the expression. And so you stay on it, you stay on the case, and you try to do right by them, and in the process do right by both the African American community and the American people as a whole. One of the major consequences of that discovery and the controversy that developed around it was that prior to that, slavery was a Southern institution. And there's a whole body of scholarship now on slavery in the North, and its uniqueness, its distinctiveness, and all, and during the colonial period and all the rest of that, all a byproduct of that of that kind of struggle. So I think wherever it's possible for libraries to institutionally position themselves around specific issues of injustice, I don't know that you're going to get permission to do it, but you do it, and you know, how you say it? Ask for forgiveness.
Well, I would just sort of underline that. I mean, like, I think librarianship has a lot of work to do to sort of acknowledge its complicity in some of these systems of injustice, but also for a lot of very good reasons, like it's a profession with a certain sort of virtuous moral standing, right? And I think that example is a beautiful way of showing, like, if you work in a profession where you have that, then use it for justice to get these things done in the world. And I think that's a way that a library can work beyond itself.
And just the last thought, also underscoring, I think, as was exemplified in Dr. Dodson's example, they knew enough to ask the library for help, right? And back to, you know, the earlier conversation about the perceptions of libraries and what we do, we can do a whole lot. We just don't necessarily have the opportunity. But we're always looking for community partners and for opportunities to engage in different projects and collaborations, et cetera. So I think, you know, we have a lot of work to do inside, but I think we also need to do some more work so people recognize us as a potential partner in this social justice fight.
And I just underscore this: institutions are known by the work that they do.
Yes.
Institutions are known by the work that they do. And if the only work that you do is gather some books and put them on the shelf, that's what you're known as.
Right.
If you let the community know that you have an interest in this or that or the other, the community will invite you into it. And there's more than enough social justice work to be done.
No sure.
Yeah, no sure.
The last word. So I would, you know, just piggyback on what my colleagues have said, and also just to say that to you all, you have a lot of power in terms of what your community library does and your university library does. And so if you have an issue you want to raise, or a group that you want to come in, or a social justice project you want to support, contact your librarians, contact the administration in your library and say, I would like to do A, B, and C, because I think people don't do that. They leave it to the institution, that sometimes we're doing things, but we're not doing the things that are important to you. So you have a lot of power and a lot of say. So reach out to your public libraries, your academic libraries, and just go in and say, okay, this is how I would like to work with you all to serve this social justice project. So it's a back and forth thing. We go out to you, of course, but please feel empowered to come into the library and take your state.
So here are Akbar Williams, Trevor Munoz, Nicole Cook, Howard Dodson. Thank you so much for first AADHum conversation. Undoubtedly, we could talk for a much longer time, but all the things that you have put out there give us so much fruitful things to chew on as we move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you.